now give the floor to the delegation of Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, thank you for giving me the floor. Sri Lanka voted in favor of the draft resolution A/78L5 entitled "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba." In keeping with past practice, this Assembly adopted with an overwhelming majority the call to lift the blockade against Cuba. It is not difficult, Mr. President, to discern the rationale. A cursory perusal of the United Nations Secretary General's report, A78/84, provides the answers. For 30 years, the General Assembly has been calling for an end to the economic embargo that the United States has imposed on Cuba since 1962. If sanctions have only created hardships and collective suffering to a population, what justification, we ask, can there be to continue a policy of repression? Mr. President, it is said that universal coercive sanctions can have unintended consequences and negative humanitarian impacts. As clearly seen in the Cuban scenario, universal coercive sanctions harm the civilian population more than the intended targets, leading to increased poverty, unemployment, and a lack of access to essential goods and services. It is also said that sanctions can undermine diplomatic efforts and hinder dialogue, making it more difficult to find peaceful resolutions to a conflict. Mr. President, unilateral sanctions and secondary sanctions aimed at universalizing the sanctions regime have been the most difficult aspects of any sanctions regime aimed at elevating such sanctions to one of collective sanctions. Unilateral sanctions can never achieve the same status as collective sanctions without exaggerated claims to jurisdiction. It is a fact that countries perceive the implications of sanctions regimes differently from one another. If one looks at the bigger picture carefully, unilateral sanctions have not had their desired effect. It is therefore time, we say, to re-examine the continuation of the sanctions against Cuba and withdraw them. We call on all those concerned to lift the imposition of unilateral coercive measures that are not authorized to relevant organs of the United Nations and are inconsistent with the principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. My delegation is of the considered view that the potential drawbacks of these sanctions outweigh the intended objectives. It must also be observed that the target entities find ways to circumvent the sanctions or find alternative allies, which renders nugatory the very purpose of imposing such sanctions. Mr. President, we must all remind ourselves of the fact that the imposition of universal coercive sanctions have been of little help and relatively ineffective in maintaining a conducive global order, improve the respect for human rights, and prevent the escalation of conflicts globally. The continued sanctions on Cuba against this backdrop appears misplaced and irrational. It is therefore time, we say, to revisit the continuation of the sanctions against Cuba with a view to their final withdrawal. I thank you, Mr. President.
I should like to thank